Welcome, I'm Bill Brewster and this is Drywall Techniques. This segment is Series 4, Drywall and Plaster Repair. At this time, let's get familiar with the tools and some of the materials we'll be using on this project.
We'll be using 20-minute hot mud and a roll of fiberglass tape. We'll also be using a drywall pan, utility knife, 6-inch knife, 12-inch knife, and a sanding sponge.
The only downside of living in the Seattle area is the occasional earthquake, which can result in cracks.
When cutting out a crack, use your utility knife and make sure you cut out all the excess plaster, texture, or paint that is fragmented across that crack. After you're done with your utility knife cutting the crack back, take your 6-inch knife and scrape off the excess material. We'll be using some powdered 20-minute hot mud mixed with water, and that'll be our pre-fill for our crack. After mixing your hot mud thoroughly, use your 6-inch knife and apply it on the crack. Make sure you wipe all excess hot mud off so it can dry. At this point, the hot mud is dried, so we need to scrape off any excess hot mud that might have come out of the crack, so we have a nice flat surface to put our fiberglass tape over. Installing fiberglass tape on cracks, I like putting a double layer of fiberglass tape. Gives it a little bit more strength, as well as fiberglass tape lays a lower profile than paper tape, so when you float out your patch, you don't have to coat it out as far. At this point, we're ready to put our first coat of hot mud on the patch. This is the consistency that you want your mud. Not too terribly thick, but yet not too runny. When coating flats, take long, even strokes. Then feather the top part of the patch, and then the bottom part of the patch. Then right down the center. Even pressure with your fingers. When applying your hot mud, make sure you use long, even strokes. You'll need to coat this patch out at least 2 to 3 knives wide in order to be able to hide it. Once it's textured and painted, any glare of sunlight could cast a shadow across this patch and cause it to show a lump. So feather your edges. And make nice, smooth swipes along the patch. These lines will sand out. Once it dries, we'll be able to come back and scrape the hot mud coat. If you want your hot mud to set up faster, use powdered alum or granulated alum in your water prior to mixing your hot mud. A tablespoon of alum can cause your hot mud to set up 10 to 15 minutes early. Now our hot mud patch is dry, so we're ready to scrape our hot mud down. Use your 6-inch knife and lightly scrape the lap marks or any imperfections, edges, what have you, off before we apply our first all-purpose coat. As we apply our first all-purpose coat, we need to make sure that we have a nice even coat. We covered the hot mud patch completely. Make sure we cover all possible recesses. feather your edges. It's important to keep this coat as smooth as possible. Being that's the first fill coat, we'll be leaving a little bit more mud on, so we have something to sand.
At this point our patch is thoroughly dry, so we will take our sanding sponge, which is a fine, extra fine sanding sponge, and sand the patch lightly. Make sure you get your edges thoroughly. And now you're ready for your skim coat. Now when you're applying your skim coat, basically all you're doing is putting it on at this point, and taking it right back off. There's really no need to be fast. Just try to take your time and keep your mud as consistent and even as possible. On your skim coat, it's possible to hurry along the drying process by either using a heat gun or a hair dryer. At this point, your patch is dry and it's ready for final sand. So at this time, you use a light, preferably a halogen light, to use for your final sanding. The way you hold the light is to hold it up towards along the ceiling or the wall line, or down or across. You never shoot it directly at the patch or the wall, because all that will do is wash out the wall and you won't be able to see any imperfections whatsoever. So by shooting it up the wall or down the wall, it's going to cause the imperfections to cast a shadow. So at this point, finish sand. The sides, pick up all the lap marks, small scratches. And it definitely is recommended to wear a particle mask at this point. But since this patch is so small, I opted not to use one. So at this point, the patch is sanded out, and you just have to water sponge it. At this point, the final sand is completed, and we're going to use a water sponge, a typical water sponge, lightly dampened, to run around the edges of the patch. What this does is dissolves the drywall mud, sheetrock mud into the existing texture. And if you were not to do this, you would end up most likely having a very pronounced edge along your patch area. And once it's retextured, you undoubtedly would see it. So at this point, with being water textured, finish sanded, you're ready to texture it. And at this point, what you'll be doing is taking the tape, putting it on the wall at your desired length of the patch. Wipe it. Do it again. Overlapping the tape. Wiping it again. Doing it again. Make sure you're overlapping the tape enough. Then apply mud around the tape, the hole, and peel the tape up. Wipe it down thoroughly and allow the tape to dry completely. This is a slightly bigger hole, so in this situation we're going to create a tear patch or a butterfly patch. So at this point what you'll be doing is finding yourself a piece of sheetrock, cutting it, scoring the front, so this is the piece of rock that we'll be using for the patch. You want something to be approximately this size. And what you'll be doing is taking this hole's dimensions, transposing it onto the back of the board. At this point, score the dimensions of the patch. After scoring the approximate dimensions of the patch on the back of your sheetrock and scoring it down the top and on the sides, take it and pop it. Then peel the rock away. At this point, clean up any residual sheetrock that's on the patch itself. So all you have is paper. After you have your patch already cut, pre-fill the edges of the hole with taping mud or hot mud. Then on the back of the patch, apply mud on the back of the patch along the edges. Then install. Be very careful at this point that you don't push the patch through the wall. Remember, when you're dealing with patches, when you coat this out, you'll be coating out quite a ways all the way around it, not just over the patch itself, because once you do that, it'll create a lump in the wall. You need to float it out quite wide so there'll be no shadowing at a later date after it's painted. Now the final patch is a nasty, ragged looking patch, something like a fist would go through or something. So there's a way of fixing this instead of the old-fashioned way of cutting from stud to stud, having a large patch which you would have to even coat out even farther. So at this point, we'll address this patch. First thing we're going to do is take care of all the loose sheetrock, especially on the inside. Just pull it away from the back. So when we install our backing, it'll go right in. And not be held up whatsoever. As you see, you have a good sized piece of backing, slide it in thusly. Make sure the backing is in there securely. And duplicate the process on this side. It's best to use plywood for backing. It's much more stronger, durable, and would hold the patch a lot better. At this point, we're ready to install the piece of sheetrock. Now after you've installed the sheetrock square, time for taping and mudding. Always let each coat dry thoroughly before applying another. At this point, our patch is dry, and now we're going to use the 20-minute hot mud we used earlier in this segment. As you can tell, it's very chunky. This particular hot mud is an older bag of 20 minutes, so it will be firing off much faster than 20 minutes. I'm not going to have to use the powdered alum like I did before. Make sure you feather your patch. Feather your patch all the way around. Feather your edges all the way around. Then lightly float the mud to the sides. So go down the center, get as flat, even as you can be happy with, and then feather the edges. One more time. Well, at this point, our hot mud is set up in record time. our 20-minute hot mud set up within about 10 minutes. That's about the only good thing about using older hot mud. It does have a tendency to set up fast. So at this point, you're ready to start scraping back your hot mud. You can totally scrape back all the lap marks, all the little imperfections. And now it's ready for the AP coat, all-purpose coat. A patch you have to coat out nice and wide, and you don't have the luxury of having a factory recessed edge to help you. While you're applying your mud, apply it evenly. And don't be surprised or alarmed if the all-purpose bubbles up a little bit over the top of the hot mud, because it will. This coat of the all-purpose will be a little heavier coat. Once you get your edges all feathered in, now that you have the patch totally covered with all-purpose mud, what I normally do is wipe from the center. You float your blade nice and even, keeping your blade, holding it low to the wall without dragging your fingers. Then when you get to the top or the bottom, you bevel it. You apply more pressure to one side and float your mud. Then for the bottom. All the perimeter of the patch should be nice and smooth, no heavy edges whatsoever. You're bound to have a couple of small little lap marks. At this point, the first coat of AP mud on our patches has dried. We sanded it, tight skimmed it, and at this point we're ready to finish sand. Remember, when doing any sanding whatsoever, make sure you wear a particle mask. It helps cut down on the dust that you inhale, and clean lungs are happy lungs. So at this point we're ready to sand. Now there are two different ways of sanding. You can use a sanding sponge, fine, extra fine sanding sponge, or you can use a sanding pole with 220 screen on it for finish sanding. I would not use anything more aggressive than that, because it'll cause scratches in your finished product and it will show up through your paint. When you're sanding between coats, it's advised to use 100 grit to 150 grit. Now we're ready to start sanding our finished product. And remember, when you're doing your finish sanding, use your light like we specified earlier in this segment. Holding it down the wall, not directly at the wall, because it'll wash out the wall with light and you will not be able to see where the imperfections are. There we go. So all that's left that we have to do to our patch is to water sponge the perimeter of the patch. Earlier in this segment, we talked about how important it was to sponge in with water around your patches, dealing with texture, blending in your texture with the mud of your patch, as well as we are working with this patch right here, blending in, being a smooth wall, you still have to blend in the mud into the paper. Sanding has a tendency to fuzz up the paper. Using a water sponge helps lay down the fuzzed up paper and gives you a better finished product. Well, we're at the end of our project, so let's recap what we've learned. Prepping the patch area, using fiberglass tape with hot mud, using powdered alum in your hot mud to get it to harden faster, scraping your hot mud after it's already hardened, coating with all-purpose compound, making a drywall tape patch, making a tear patch, and installing backing for larger patches, sponging the edges of the patch with water to blend into the texture. Well, thank you for watching, and see you next time on Drywall Techniques.